She loved him in a world that was never meant to let them be together. But when Tariq was taken from her, Rachel, a black woman trapped between grief and truth, uncovered a secret that changed everything. Now, with the past clawing at her heels and danger closing in, she must decide, will she walk away, or will she finish what he started? If you love powerful, emotional stories about love, loss, and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The air in 1980s America was thick with tension. The country was still haunted by the echoes of segregation, the scars of civil rights battles, and the relentless weight of systemic oppression. In small towns and sprawling cities, the lines were drawn, firm and unyielding. Black communities lived in neighborhoods marked by their struggle, while white families lived in houses that gleamed with the privilege of generations unchallenged. It was a time of fragile progress, but also one of terrifying danger, where stepping out of your place could lead to swift punishment. In the heart of this turbulent world, two souls met, drawn together by forces that neither fully understood nor could control. Tariq Johnson was a young black man, born into the harsh realities of poverty, but gifted with a mind that refused to be limited by the circumstances of his birth. He worked tirelessly at a mechanic's shop in the outskirts of town, his hands stained with oil and grease, but his mind always reaching for something more. He dreamed of freedom, freedom from the chains of expectation that weighed heavily on him. His mother, a woman with the spirit of an African queen, had always warned him about the world outside. "The world ain't kind to us, Tariq. They'll take everything you give them, and still find a way to make you small." Her words echoed in his mind, as he struggled to understand the depth of the divisions around him. The truth was, Tariq had never known a world where his skin didn't mark him as something different, something less. But he was determined to rise above it, to prove that his worth wasn't defined by the color of his skin. That was until he met Rachel Summers. Rachel, with her porcelain skin, golden hair, and blue eyes that had never known the sting of prejudice. She was a product of the world Tariq had always been taught to fear, a world where privilege flowed as easily as water, and where every door seemed open to her simply because of the family she was born into. Rachel's father was a respected businessman in the town, his wealth and influence woven into the very fabric of the community. Her mother, a woman of refined manners, had been raised in the kind of wealth that afforded them things most people could only dream of. Rachel, however, was different from the other white girls in town. She didn't buy into the smug complacency of her privilege. She would often spend hours in the local library, reading books about cultures she didn't know, asking questions that made the people around her uncomfortable. It was in that library that she first saw Tariq. She had been studying, the quiet hum of the overhead lights mingling with the occasional rustling of pages, when she noticed him across the room. Tariq had been reading a thick volume on philosophy, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something about the way he carried himself, something intense and earnest, that caught her attention. It wasn't that he looked like the men she had grown up around, those who took pride in their suits and ties, their perfect manners, and clean-cut appearances. No, Tariq's look was raw, unpolished. He had the presence of someone who had fought, someone who had seen things most people could never comprehend. Rachel was intrigued. She watched him for days before gathering the courage to speak to him, and when she finally did, it was like a spark igniting in the middle of a dry forest. "Hi," she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Rachel. I've seen you in here before." Tariq looked up, startled at first, then his eyes softened as he realized she wasn't just some curious white girl out of place. She seemed genuine. "Tariq," he replied with a nod. The conversation started slow, a cautious exchange of words, as they navigated the spaces between their worlds. They spoke of books, of ideas, of dreams. Tariq found himself drawn to her honesty, her open-mindedness, and the way she questioned the world with such fierce curiosity. Rachel, on the other hand, was captivated by his depth, the way his words held weight, like each one had been earned through years of struggle and perseverance. It wasn't long before their conversations turned into something more, a connection that neither could deny, even if they knew it was forbidden. As the weeks passed, they found secret places to meet, quiet corners of the town, a small park, a spot by the river where no one could see them. But even in the shadows, their love was dangerous. In the world they lived in, such a relationship was an affront to everything society held sacred. Tariq knew that any word of their love could destroy him, could ruin his reputation and possibly even his life. Rachel, too, understood the risks, but her heart had already become entwined with his, and the fear of losing him seemed more terrifying than anything her family or society could throw at her. There were moments when they would hold each other in the quiet of the night, their bodies trembling from the weight of the world outside. Tariq would kiss her forehead and whisper promises of a future they both knew they couldn't have. "One day," he would say, "one day we'll be free." But that day never came. The walls around them began to close in. Rumors spread, whispers grew louder, and soon, the whole town seemed to know about them. Rachel's parents were the first to find out. Her mother had always been suspicious of her daughter's strange behavior, her late nights, her growing distance from the expectations of her class. One evening, Rachel's mother followed her to the library, catching sight of her entering the building with Tariq. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Rachel was forced to choose her family, her life as she knew it, or the man she had come to love. "You don't know what you're doing, Rachel," her mother had screamed, her face twisted in anger and fear. "This is not who you are. You're throwing everything away for some black man. Rachel stood frozen, her chest tight with the weight of her mother's words, but she knew she couldn't turn back. She couldn't betray her heart. But it wasn't just her family that posed a threat. The town had its own brand of justice. People whispered in darkened corners, eyes narrowed in judgment. Tariq could see the tension in the air, could feel the weight of stares burning into his back when he walked through the streets. He knew it wouldn't be long before violence erupted. And then, one night, it did. They had been meeting in their usual spot by the river when a group of white men from town appeared, their faces contorted in hatred. They didn't say a word, but their presence spoke volumes. Tariq stood between Rachel and them, his fists clenched, his body tense, but there was nothing he could do. He was outnumbered, and he knew that any act of resistance could mean death. The leader of the group, a man named Daniel Carter, stepped forward, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You think you can just waltz around with a white woman, boy?" Daniel sneered. "You don't belong here. This is our town." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she knew the danger of it all. Tariq was right. If they fought, they would both die. But Tariq was determined not to let them hurt her. He turned to Rachel, his voice low but filled with an undeniable strength. "Run, Rachel! Get out of here! Go!" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I won't leave you. You have to," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I love you. Go!" With a final, desperate kiss, Rachel ran. The men turned their attention to Tariq, their fists landing hard and fast, their cruelty unimaginable. By the time the police arrived, it was too late. Tariq lay on the ground, blood staining the earth beneath him. Rachel never stopped running. She never stopped looking back, but she never returned to him. She couldn't. The world had already taken too much. In the months that followed, Rachel lived in a state of numbness, haunted by the memory of his words, his love. She could never escape the truth of what had happened, nor could she escape the guilt that gnawed at her every waking moment. She had abandoned him when he needed her most. Years later, after Tariq had been buried in the ground, Rachel received a letter. It was from Tariq's mother. Inside was a simple note, but it was a revelation that shattered everything Rachel had ever known. "Tariq was never the man you thought he was," the letter read. "He carried a secret that could have saved him, but he never told you." Rachel's heart stopped. What secret? What had she never known? The letter didn't answer her question. But as she sat there, staring at the words, She realized that the love they had shared was more complex, more tragic than she could have ever understood. There was a hidden truth buried deep within their love story, a truth that might have changed everything, but would never be revealed. And so, Rachel was left alone, with the weight of that secret and the knowledge that she had lost him forever, a man who, perhaps, had loved her in a way she could never fully understand. The truth of their love would never be fully known. The tragedy of it would linger, long after the years had passed, in the quiet places where only memories could live. Rachel sat by the window of a small apartment in New York, the city's neon glow flickering against the glass, its restless energy a stark contrast to the void inside her. She had fled her town after Tariq's death, unable to bear the accusing stares, the whispers that followed her like ghosts. She had left behind her family, her name, everything that had once defined her, but she could never leave behind the weight of what had happened. The letter from Tariq's mother sat on the table before her, its words etched into her mind like a scar. Tariq was never the man you thought he was. He carried a secret that could have saved him, but he never told you. The sentence haunted her, an open wound that refused to heal. What had she not known? What had Tariq kept from her? The possibilities tormented her in the quiet hours of the night. Had he been planning to run away? Had he been hiding something that could have protected him from the men who took his life? Or had he simply known that their love was doomed from the start, and had chosen to shield her from the inevitable? She had no answers, only the aching emptiness that came with never truly knowing the man she had given her heart to. The city was merciless in its indifference. She had found a job as a waitress in a dimly lit cafe near Harlem, a place where she could disappear into the rhythm of serving coffee and wiping down tables, where no one knew her story, where she was just another nameless soul trying to survive. The cafe was a haven of sorts, filled with poets and drifters, old men who spoke in hushed tones about revolutions that never came, musicians who played songs that ached with longing. It was here, in the smoke-filled air and the quiet hum of jazz, that she began to piece herself together, though the cracks never fully healed. But the past was never far behind. One evening, as she cleared a table near the window, a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. Rachel Summers. Her breath caught. The voice was low, deliberate, and unmistakably from home. She turned slowly, her pulse hammering in her throat. It was Daniel Carter, the man who had led the attack on Tariq, the man whose hatred had ripped her world apart. He was older now, his once boyish face hardened by time, but the smirk that curled his lips was the same. He leaned back in his chair, watching her with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said, swirling the drink in his hand. "Heard you ran off. Guess you couldn't handle the shame." Rage flared in Rachel's chest, hot and consuming, but she forced herself to remain still. She had spent years imagining this moment, the things she would say, the revenge she would take, but now that he was here, the words caught in her throat. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice ice. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax. I ain't here to start trouble. Just thought you should know something. About Tariq." Her stomach tightened. "You don't get to say his name," she hissed. "You don't get to speak about him like you ever knew him." Daniel smirked again, but there was something in his eyes, a glint of amusement, of knowing. "You really never knew, did you?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Tariq wasn't just some nobody from the poor side of town. He was one of them radicals. Black Panthers. Underground movements. He was dangerous, Rachel. He was playing with fire." The words hit her like a physical blow. Tariq had never spoken of politics, never told her of any involvement in anything larger than himself. But now, the pieces started falling into place. The quiet tension in his voice when he spoke about the world. The way he avoided certain places, certain people. The way he always seemed to be looking over his shoulder. Had he been hiding this from her to protect her? Or had she been too blinded by her own love to see the truth? Daniel watched her reaction with satisfaction. They were gonna come for him one way or another, he said. We just got there first. Rachel's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to lunge at him, to tear him apart with her bare hands, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. Tariq was gone. Nothing would bring him back. But now, there was a new weight to her grief, a new layer of betrayal. Tariq had kept this from her. He had carried a life she had never been part of, a fight she had never known. Had she ever truly known him at all? That night, she walked the streets of the city, the cold air biting at her skin, her mind a storm of memories and questions. She thought of the way Tariq had looked at her that last night by the river, the urgency in his voice when he told her to run. Had he known that his past would catch up to him? Had he accepted his fate before she even realized there was a battle being fought? She thought of his mother's letter, the cryptic words that now made cruel sense. He carried a secret that could have saved him. Was this what she meant? That if Tariq had been willing to expose himself, to reveal the truth, he might have survived? Or was there more? Rachel didn't know. And she never would. All she had now were ghosts. The next morning, she made a decision. She packed a small bag, withdrew the last of her savings, and boarded a train back home. She hadn't set foot in that town since the night she ran, and the thought of returning filled her with dread, but she had to know. She had to face whatever truth still lingered in the places where Tariq had once walked. The town was unchanged, frozen in time like a photograph. The same cracked sidewalks, the same old men sitting outside the diner, the same wary glances that followed her as she stepped off the train. She walked to Tariq's mother's house, her hands trembling as she knocked on the door. The woman who answered was older now, grief etched into every line of her face, but her eyes were the same, sharp, knowing. "I knew you'd come back," she said, stepping aside to let Rachel in. The house was filled with memories, photographs of Tariq on the walls, books stacked in neat piles, a presence that was both comforting and suffocating. Rachel sat down, her throat tight. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me what he never did." Tariq's mother studied her for a long moment before sighing, as if she had been waiting years for this moment. "He loved you," she said finally. "More than anything. But he knew the world wouldn't let you love him back. Not the way he wanted." Rachel shook her head. "That's not what I mean. I know about the Panthers. I know about what he was involved in." The older woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "Then you know he was fighting for something bigger than himself. Bigger than you." The word stung, but Rachel understood. She had been a part of Tariq's world, but never all of it. She had seen his dreams, but never the risks he had taken. He had loved her, but he had also known that love was not enough to protect him. And in the end, he had died with his secrets. Rachel left the house with no more answers than she had come with, only a deeper ache, a deeper understanding of how little she had truly known the man she had loved. She walked to the river, their river, where the wind whispered through the trees, where the ghosts of their laughter still lingered. She closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. And then she whispered into the wind, "I loved you too." The wind carried her words away, lost in the vastness of the world. But somewhere, somehow, she hoped he heard them. Rachel stood by the river, the wind tangling through her hair, the cold biting into her skin, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The water shimmered beneath the moonlight, dark and endless, and she could almost see him there, standing just beyond reach, his hands in his pockets, his lips curved into that half-smile that had always undone her. But he wasn't there. He never would be again. The wind carried only memories, the echo of his laughter, the weight of his touch, the unspoken words that had been swallowed by time and fate. She had come back to this place searching for truth, but truth was slippery, elusive. What she had found instead was an absence, a hollow space where Tariq had once stood, a silence where his voice had once filled the air. And now, she didn't know what to do with it. She had spent years running, years trying to escape the shape of his absence, the heaviness of what had been stolen from them. But now that she was here, there was nowhere left to run. The past had caught up to her. The past had always been waiting. She pressed a hand to her chest as if she could press back the ache, as if she could hold herself together with just the force of her fingers against her ribs, but nothing could contain the unraveling. The truth Daniel had told her gnawed at her, tangled in her ribs like thorns. Tariq had been fighting a war she hadn't even known existed. A war he had kept from her, not out of distrust, but out of protection. And maybe, just maybe, he had known, even in those quiet moments when they had whispered dreams beneath the stars, that their love had never belonged to them alone. It had belonged to the world that sought to tear them apart. It had belonged to the hands of men who had decided, long before they were born, that a love like theirs could not exist. But still, they had tried. Still, they had reached for each other, even knowing the cost. Rachel closed her eyes and saw him again, the first time she had met him in the library, the way he had looked up at her, worried but intrigued, the way his voice had wrapped around her name like a secret. She had thought she had all the time in the world to know him, to love him. But time had never been on their side. She exhaled sharply and turned away from the water, her footsteps heavy, as she walked back through the town that had never been kind to them. The streets were empty, silent, the houses dark and watchful. She passed the diner where she and Tariq had once sat in the back booth, hands brushing beneath the table, pretending they were just like everyone else. She passed the school where she had spent years learning only half-truths, where she had never been taught about men like Tariq, men who had fought and bled for something more. She passed the church where her mother had once held her hand so tightly in the pews, whispering prayers that had never included people like him. And finally, she stopped in front of the house she had once called home. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow against the night. For a moment, she hesitated, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't spoken to her parents in years. Hadn't wanted to. After Tariq, they had made their choice. They had chosen silence. They had chosen shame. But now, standing here, she realized she wasn't the same girl who had run away. She was something else, something sharper, something heavier with grief and knowledge. She climbed the steps slowly, her hands cold as she reached for the doorknob, but before she could turn it, the door swung open. Her mother stood there, older, her face lined with worry, with the weight of time and regret. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, neither speaking. And then, her mother whispered, "You came back." Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I needed to know." Her mother exhaled, stepping aside, letting her in. The house smelled the same, wood polish and faint traces of lavender. Everything was familiar, painfully so. She walked through the room slowly, memories pressing in from all sides. The living room where she had once sat with her father, listening to his stern lectures about respectability. The kitchen where her mother had braided her hair in the mornings, humming softly. And finally, the dining room, where her father sat now, his hands folded on the table, his gaze heavy when he looked up at her. "Rachel," he said, his voice unreadable. She sat down across from him, her fingers curling into fists against her lap. "I need to know the truth," she said. "About Tariq. About everything." Her father's jaw tightened. Her mother sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, no one spoke. And then, finally, her father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We tried to protect you," he said, his voice rough. "We knew about Tariq. We knew what he was involved in. And we knew it would get him killed." Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You knew?" she whispered. "You knew, and you didn't tell me?" Her father's expression darkened. "We wanted you safe. Do you know what happens to girls like you? White girls who step out of line, who love men they're not supposed to love. Do you know what they would have done to you, Rachel?" She shook her head, her breath unsteady. "I would have rather known the truth than lived with the lies." Her mother reached for her hand, her eyes glistening. "We didn't know how to save you," she whispered. "So we did nothing. and I will regret it for the rest of my life." Rachel pulled her hand away, standing up abruptly. The walls of the house felt too close, the air too thick. She had come looking for answers, but all she had found were more ghosts, more betrayal. She turned toward the door, her pulse hammering. "Where are you going?" her mother called after her. Rachel didn't look back. "I don't know," she said. And it was the truth. She walked through the streets, past the empty buildings, past the places where their love had once lived and died. The weight of it all pressed down on her, but there was something else too, something that burned beneath her ribs, something that felt like rage, like sorrow, like an unbearable longing. She had spent so many years running from this town, from this story, from the pain of what had been stolen from her. But now she understood. She would never outrun it. This story was hers. This history was hers. And maybe, just maybe, she had to carry it, no matter how heavy it was. The past could not be undone. Tariq was gone. His truth had been buried with him. But Rachel was still here. And she would remember. She would never let the world forget. Rachel kept walking, her feet moving without direction, the cold night air sharp against her skin, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest like a stone. The town felt smaller now, its streets suffocating, its silence thick with ghosts. She could still see him, even when she closed her eyes, Tariq standing on the steps of the library, leaning against the brick wall, his head tilted just slightly, watching her with that quiet intensity, that knowing look that always made her feel as though he saw something in her she hadn't even seen in herself. She had spent years trying to forget, trying to bury the sound of his voice, the feel of his hand in hers, the way he had once whispered against her skin that he would love her even if the world turned to ash around them. But the past had a way of finding her, dragging her back, demanding to be remembered. And now, standing in the place where it had all begun, she could no longer pretend that she could erase him. The streets were empty, but she could feel the past here, feel the weight of all the things unsaid, all the warnings she had ignored, all the moments that had led them to that night by the river, to the sound of fists against flesh, to the gunshot that had shattered everything. She found herself standing in front of the old school, its windows dark, its doors locked, but she could still hear the echoes of laughter, the murmurs of teenage gossip, the whispers behind her back when she had first been seen with Tariq, the way the stairs had lingered, the way the air had grown charged with something dangerous, something unspoken but understood. She remembered the way her father had looked at her the night he had first found out, the way his face had darkened with something cold and unfamiliar. "You're playing with fire," he had said, his voice low, steady, edged with something that felt like a warning and a threat all at once. "You think love can save you from this world? It can't. And it won't." She had been too young to understand then, too blinded by the depth of what she felt, too caught up in the way Tariq had made her feel like she was more than just another girl born into privilege, more than just someone expected to follow a path laid out for her before she even had a choice. She had believed in them, in the quiet moments, in the stolen kisses, in the whispered dreams of running away, of starting over somewhere no one could touch them. But dreams were fragile things. And love was not enough to protect them from the world that had already decided how their story would end. She turned away from the school and kept walking, her breath coming in sharp bursts, the cold settling into her bones, the memories clawing at her, refusing to let go. She passed the alley where Tariq had kissed her for the first time, his hands framing her face as if she were something precious, something worth holding on to. She passed the corner store where they used to meet in secret, pretending they were just two people in love, pretending that love could exist in a world like this without consequence. And then, finally, she found herself back at the river, the place where it had ended. The wind stirred the water, sending ripples across the surface, and she could still see him there, standing in the moonlight, his eyes locked on hers, his voice calm even as he told her to run. She hadn't run fast enough. She should have held on to him, should have pulled him away, should have done something, anything to keep him from slipping through her fingers. But it was too late for should-haves. It was too late for anything. She sank to her knees, the cold earth biting into her skin, her breath ragged, her hands trembling as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the letter. Tariq's mother's words burned into her mind, looping over and over, haunting her. He carried a secret that could have saved him, but he never told you. What had he been keeping from her? What had he known that night that she hadn't? The question twisted inside her, a blade she couldn't pull free. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for this moment, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Slow, deliberate. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat, her body tensing as she turned. And there, standing at the edge of the trees, was Daniel Carter. He looked different now, older, the arrogance in his stance tempered by something darker, something heavier. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had never feared the consequences of his actions. "Didn't think I'd see you back here," he said, his voice smooth, casual, as if they were nothing more than old acquaintances running into each other on the street. Rachel's hands curled into fists. "What do you want?" He took a slow step forward, the smirk on his lips sharpening. "I want to know why you came back. That's none of your business, isn't it?" His gaze flickered to the letter in her hand. "Still chasing ghosts, Rachel? Still looking for something that's never gonna bring him back?" A wave of fury surged through her, hot and blinding. "You don't get to say his name," she spat. "You don't get to stand here and pretend like you weren't the one who—" She stopped, the words choking her, burning her throat. But Daniel only smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips. "You really think you knew him?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "You think you knew everything about Tariq? About what he was doing? About what he was willing to do?" Rachel's stomach twisted. "Shut up. He wasn't just some Lussick boy, Rachel. He wasn't just your little secret. He was playing a dangerous game. And he knew exactly what was coming for him." Her heart pounded against her ribs. "You're lying. Am I?" He took another step closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe he didn't tell you because he knew you wouldn't be able to handle the truth. Maybe he kept you in the dark because he knew you'd run the second you found out who he really was. You don't know anything about us," she hissed. "Don't I?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe Tariq wasn't the man you thought he was. Maybe he wasn't just a victim. Maybe he was willing to do whatever it took for the cause he believed in, even if it meant dying for it." A chill ran down her spine. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Tariq had never been like that he had never been reckless, that he had never been willing to throw his life away. But doubt crept in, sharp and insidious. Had he known? Had he walked into that night knowing it would be his last? Had he made peace with his fate long before she had even understood the danger they were in? Daniel watched her, his smirk widening as he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. "You can run all you want, Rachel," he said. "But the truth? It'll always catch up to you." And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving her standing there alone, the river whispering against the shore, the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud. Rachel stood frozen by the river, her breath unsteady, her pulse hammering as Daniel's words echoed in her head, winding through her thoughts like a sickness, unraveling everything she thought she knew, everything she had clung to in the wake of Tariq's death. Maybe he wasn't the man you thought he was. Maybe he knew exactly what was coming. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to let doubt seep into the love she had spent years carrying like a wound that never healed, but the weight of Daniel's smirk, the ease with which he had spoken those words, the certainty behind them, it clawed at something buried deep in her chest. The past had always been murky, shadowed by fear and silence, but what if she had only seen the parts of Tariq that he had wanted her to see? What if there was more, so much more, that had been hidden from her? The wind howled through the trees, shaking the branches, stirring the water, the night stretching endlessly before her. She clutched the letter in her trembling hands. Tariq's mother's words burned into her mind. He carried a secret that could have saved him, but he never told you. But why? Why had he kept it from her? What had he been protecting her from? Or had he been protecting himself? The weight of it was unbearable, suffocating, twisting through her ribs like a vice. She turned abruptly, her feet moving before she could think, before she could stop herself, her body fueled by something sharp and desperate and aching, her breath coming in quick bursts as she walked, then ran, through the empty streets of the town, past the school, past the church, past the old houses with their windows dark, past the ghosts that seemed to watch her from every shadow. She didn't stop until she reached the house at the edge of town, the house she had once sat in as a girl, too afraid to speak, too afraid to ask questions she wasn't ready to know the answers to. She pounded on the door, her fists striking the wood with a force that rattled through her bones, and for a moment, there was nothing, just silence, just the night stretching on endlessly around her, and then the door creaked open, and Mrs. Johnson stood there, her face weary, her eyes red-rimmed and sunken, as if she had never truly stopped grieving. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice brittle, tired, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she had always known Rachel would come back, that she would need the truth eventually. Rachel's breath came fast and sharp, her chest rising and falling violently. "I need to know," she said, her voice raw, unsteady. "I need to know what he was hiding from me." Mrs. Johnson exhaled slowly, stepping back, opening the door wider, and Rachel hesitated only for a second before stepping inside, the house smelling of dust and time and something else, something like sorrow, something that had lingered in the walls long after Tariq had gone. The living room was dimly lit, the old couch sagging with age, photos lining the mantel, images of a life that had been stolen too soon. Rachel's eyes drifted to the framed picture of Tariq, the one taken just a few months before he died, his gaze steady, his lips pressed into a small, knowing smile, as if he had already seen the end coming. Mrs. Johnson watched her, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the box sitting on the table, the lid worn, the edges frayed, and Rachel's stomach twisted with something like dread, something like anticipation, because she knew, that whatever was inside was going to change everything. Mrs. Johnson sat down, motioning for Rachel to do the same, and Rachel lowered herself into the chair across from her, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Mrs. Johnson lifted the lid, her fingers brushing over the letters inside, the old notebook, the folded newspaper clippings, all of it worn with time, with use, with the weight of the past that had never truly let go. "Tariq wasn't just some boy from the wrong side of town," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice quiet, thick with something Rachel couldn't quite name. "He was involved in something bigger, something dangerous. He never told you because he knew if he did, you'd try to stop him. And he couldn't let that happen." Rachel's hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms. "What was he doing?" she whispered, the words barely audible, but Mrs. Johnson heard them, and she sighed, shaking her head, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the letters. "He was working with a group," she said. "A movement. They were fighting against everything this town stood for, the racism, the violence, the way people like Daniel Carter and his father ran things like they were untouchable. They were gathering evidence, preparing to expose the corruption, the police, the politicians, all of it. And Tariq was at the center of it." The word sent a jolt through Rachel, her mind reeling. "He never told me," she said, shaking her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never said a word. Because he knew you would have been in danger," Mrs. Johnson said. "He knew they would come for him eventually, but he hoped, that they would leave you alone. He was trying to protect you, Rachel, even if it meant keeping you in the dark." Rachel's breath hitched, her hand shaking as she reached for one of the letters, her fingers ghosting over Tariq's handwriting, the familiar scrawl sending a fresh wave of grief through her. "Asterisk Rachel, if you ever find this, it means I didn't make it out. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all the things I never told you, for the nights I spent pretending we had forever when I knew, deep down, that we didn't. But I need you to understand. I couldn't just stand by and watch them destroy people, destroy lives. I couldn't just look the other way. I had to fight. Even if it meant losing you. Even if it meant losing everything. And I know you'll hate me for this. I know you'll never forgive me for not telling you. But I need you to know that every moment with you is real. Every touch, every word, every dream we whispered into the dark. That was real. And I would do it all over again, even knowing how it ends. Because you were the only thing that ever made this life feel like something more. You were the only thing that ever made me believe in something better. Rachel clutched the letter against her chest, her vision blurring, her whole body trembling as the truth crashed over her, as everything shattered and reassembled into something new, something raw and unbearable. He had known. He had always known. He had walked into the fire willingly, not because he wanted to die, but because he had believed in something bigger than himself, something he had never shared with her, something she had never been allowed to carry with him. And now, she was left with the pieces, with the echoes of his choices, with the weight of a love that had never belonged only to them. She sucked in a sharp breath, her gaze lifting to meet Mrs. Johnson's, and for the first time in years, she understood, truly understood, that Tariq had never just been hers. He had belonged to the fight, to the resistance, to the people who had needed him more than she ever had. And he had died for it. Not just because he had loved her, not just because they had been doomed from the start, but because he had dared to dream of something more. And now, Rachel had to decide what to do with that truth. Because the past was not just the past. It was still here. It was still waiting. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't done fighting yet. Rachel sat in the dim light of Mrs. Johnson's living room, Tariq's letter still clutched in her hands, the paper trembling as though it carried the weight of his ghost. She could hear the clock ticking faintly in the background, each second dragging her deeper into the realization that she had spent years mourning a love that had been real, yes, but incomplete, a love wrapped in secrets, a love built on stolen moments that had never truly belonged to them alone. He had been fighting a war she hadn't even known existed, a war she had unknowingly been protected from, a war that had taken him before she could ever understand what it meant to stand beside him in the way he had always deserved. The words on the page burned into her, each sentence carving a deeper wound, each revelation unraveling the version of Tariq she had held onto for so long. He had chosen this. He had known what would happen. He had known the danger, the risks, and yet he had gone forward anyway, leaving her behind in the safety of ignorance. Had she ever really known him? Had she ever really been a part of his world? Or had she only been a fleeting dream, a moment of softness before the inevitable end? She forced herself to look at Mrs. Johnson, who sat across from her with tired eyes, her hands folded in her lap, as if she had lived this moment 1,000 times, as if she had waited for the day Rachel would come back, searching for the truth, needing answers she had not been ready for before. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rachel whispered, her voice hoarse, the weight of grief tightening around her throat. Mrs. Johnson exhaled slowly, her gaze heavy with sorrow. "Because he didn't want you to know," she said simply. "Because he wanted you to be free." Rachel let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Free?" she repeated. "I was never free. I've been trapped in the past for years, haunted by him, by that night, by all the things I never got to say." Mrs. Johnson's eyes softened, and for the first time, there was something there that looked almost like understanding. "That's what love does, baby," she murmured. "It don't let go easy." Rachel squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heel of her palm against her forehead, trying to silence the storm inside her. But she couldn't. Not anymore. Because now she knew. Now she understood. And knowing meant she had a choice. She could leave. She could walk away, pretend that none of this mattered, that Tariq's fight had died with him, that his cause had been buried along with his body. Or she could do what he never got the chance to. She could pick up the pieces he left behind. She could carry forward what he had started. The thought terrified her. She had spent years running from this town, from its whispers, from its scars, from its ghosts. Could she really face it again? Could she really step into a fight that had already stolen so much from her? But then she thought of Tariq standing by the river, his eyes steady, his voice calm, even as he told her to run. She thought of his hands in hers, the way he had held on so tightly, as if trying to memorize the shape of her before letting go. She thought of the way he had looked at her, always with a quiet kind of knowing, as if he had already seen the ending long before she had even begun to understand the story. And she knew. She had already made her choice the moment she stepped back into this town, the moment she let herself remember, the moment she stopped pretending that love was ever something that could be buried. She inhaled sharply and stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. "I need to see it," she said. Mrs. Johnson frowned. "See what?" "Everything," Rachel said. "The evidence. The things he was working on. The things he died for." Mrs. Johnson studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. She reached for the box again, this time pulling out a stack of old notebooks, folded letters, newspaper clippings that had never been published, names scrawled in the margins, names Rachel recognized, names of people who still held power in this town, names of people who had been behind Tariq's death, behind so many others. As she flipped through the pages, the truth came into focus with painful clarity. The Carters, the police, the council members, the men who sat in their high-backed chairs and decided who got to live and who had to disappear. Tariq had been right. He had been so close to exposing them, and they had silenced him before he could. Rachel's hands tightened around the pages, her heart pounding. The past wasn't just the past. It was still here. The same people still ruled this town, still carried their secrets, still walked free while Tariq lay 6 feet underground. And for the first time in years, she felt something more than grief, more than sorrow. She felt rage. She felt purpose. She felt the fire that had burned inside of Tariq, the fire he had never let her see, the fire that had driven him to his death. And now, it was inside of her, too. She spent the next few weeks digging deeper, following the threads Tariq had left behind, gathering the pieces of a puzzle that had never been solved. She met with the few people still willing to speak, the ones who had been part of the movement, the ones who had been too afraid to keep fighting after Tariq's death. She pieced together the final days of his life, the people he had spoken to, the meetings he had attended in secret. She uncovered the files he had hidden away, the recordings, the testimonies, the undeniable proof of corruption. And with each revelation, the weight of what she was about to do grew heavier. The night before she was set to release everything, the documents, the names, the stories, she stood by the river once more, staring at the water, the place where everything had ended. But tonight, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. She closed her eyes and let the wind carry her breath away, let the past settle around her one final time. "I'm not running anymore," she whispered, her voice steady. "I'm not afraid." And for the first time in years, she felt Tariq beside her, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something more, something living inside of her. The morning came, and with it, the reckoning. The names went public. The truth spilled out like gasoline, setting the town ablaze. The men who had hidden behind their power for so long could no longer escape the light. And Rachel stood in the center of it all, unshaken, unbroken, no longer the girl who had once run away. She had found her place. She had found her purpose. And even though it had come too late, even though Tariq was not there to see it, she knew. He would have been proud. The past would never let go, but neither would she. Love had not been enough to save them. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough to change the world he left behind.